Michael Walsh is a great contributor to our public policy conversation, notably through both his books and his screenwriting, his media criticism, and his extraordinarily compelling public presentations, of which I'm sure this is going to be one. He's the author of numerous books, including most recently, I believe, The Devil's Pleasure Palace. We're delighted to have him here to talk a bit about what, as I said, the Chinese Communist Party is doing right here in America through its various assaults on our culture. With that, Michael, welcome.
Thank you very much, Frank. Thanks for everybody for being here. I'm going to, well, first I want to say this 5G thing sounds great, doesn't it? Your neighbor's going to know what's in your refrigerator, and you're going to die of radiation poisoning. So who wouldn't want to live in this brave new world? Yeah, that said, I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about cultural context for what we're all talking about here. This is more or less what I do for a living. And in a couple of books, The Devil's Pleasure Palace, and even more recently, The Fiery Angel, I've talked about the restoration of our own cultural confidence as we encounter other cultures who are not ours. And it's a very difficult concept for politically correct Americans to grasp right now, but it's very important in order to understand the challenges that we face. Now, I'll start with a little personal anecdote. I was working on a movie that will never get produced, unfortunately. I was the 5th writer on that movie. There was several quite distinguished Hollywood writers, including an Oscar winner who had worked on it as well. It was set in Shanghai, China, during the Second World War, and in particular in the Jewish ghetto in Shanghai, which was quite an amazing historical moment. So many prominent Jewish Americans have come out of that ghetto, including Professor Lawrence Tribe, whose work you all know, the pianist Misha Dichter, and the producer Mike Medavoy, with whom I was working on this movie. And what we found as we wrote a story, a love story about a Russian pianist who falls in love with a Chinese girl and their sort of star-crossed relationship, we found there was a dramatic difference in drama. That is to say, in America, we understand the point of a love triangle. He's in love with her and she's married to him, or however you want to adjust that triangle. What we don't have is a love square. So he's married to her and she's married to him, and they're kind of in love, but nothing happens. And what we found dealing with the Chinese censors was they would not allow the lovers to ever consummate their relationship and insisted on having the other 2 spouses as part of the drama. Well, this is no drama, and it's the main reason that this movie has not been made and probably never will be made. But luckily I have a wonderful agent who said to me when he made this deal, "I got you a great deal on this movie, don't worry, it's never going to get made." So welcome to Hollywood, kid. What I'm getting at is the lack of understanding of cultural differences. It used to be something that was quite well remarked upon and no one argued about it. But it's taken on a vague flavor of cultural imperialism and racism to articulate what's the difference between China, say, and the United States. What's the difference between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire? What's the difference? And so we squeamishly tiptoe around this often, but I think a look back at history helps us understand this. I was just down in Florida with my 93-year-old father who landed at Incheon in 1950 and with the 2-5 survived the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, for which he was awarded a Bronze Star for heroism. He later served with the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization as an American representative, and he pointed out that he thought that our failure in Vietnam, among other places, was consistent with our inability to understand that our objectives were not necessarily those of the South Vietnamese, and that furthermore they had higher and overriding issues beyond the strategic plans for victory in Vietnam. That is to say, They were more tribal, they were more local, they were more entwined with the local political culture, and the Americans coming in and expecting them to act like Americans did not work, as we all know. So we ignored these differences at our peril. And when it comes to China now, we face the following. I mention this because in Hollywood these days we're quite dependent on Chinese financing, which has just effectively dried up because of the trade war with China. This is a mixed report because in my experience, both as a writer and as a producer, we have found that the Chinese attitude towards contracts is, shall we say, a little eccentric by our standards. In other words, they feel perfectly free not to honor a signed contract. And what they will tell you is, when you're waiting for the money to come through, oh, things have changed, and therefore, come and get it. So I had a friend and colleague who started a very prominent business dependent on Chinese financing. One day the check didn't come through. He closed that business the next day because he realized that money was never coming through, even though he had a signed contract. I worked with a production company in China on a particular movie. They decided they didn't want to do it, and furthermore, they didn't want to pay us either. So this makes it very difficult for us to do business in China. Now, the contemporary understanding of the Chinese pirating of intellectual property is partially correct, which is to say that they will take stuff and publish it on their own without paying you anything. We were all familiar in the early days of videos that we would see movies on video being pirated before the movie was even out of into the theaters, rather, or had just been shown once and someone videotaped it. That's now changed, and China has an enormous film industry. It's the largest in the world. It doesn't need us to do anything. It can make versions of tropes, of cultural stories, but always in a Chinese context. So there is no Chinese Tom Cruise who will be an international box office star, but they don't need it. So they no longer steal things the way they used to. Rather, China has developed its own enormous film industry and basically exists without reference to ours. It used to be, as I said, that we would regard certain cultures as alien, not in a particularly negative sense, but possibly antithetical, so that in the famous book 15 Decisive Battles in History, Sir Edward Creasy can write of, say, Gaugamela, where Alexander defeats the Persian Empire decisively, that it was a battle between Greek individualism and Oriental despotism. We understood that the Persian Empire had a different attitude towards individual rights than the hoplites of the Greeks, for example. Today, this makes us uncomfortable. But if we look at the map, and we've been talking about, and we will talk more, I'm sure, about the Belt and Road Initiative, this is really nothing more than the old Chinese Silk Road come back thousands of years later. Those of us who respect history and learn from it, hopefully, understand that cultures don't change, people don't change. Unless some catastrophic thing has happened to wipe them off the map, what was true for the interaction between the Roman Empire and the Chinese kingdom is also true for us today. The Roman women loved the Chinese silks, and the Roman Empire spent a lot of money getting goods from China all the way across the Silk Road and into the empire. In fact, they complained about it all the time, how much their wives were spending on Chinese silks. So not much has changed in terms of the importance of contact and economic traffic between two very different worlds, but the Romans and the Chinese kingdom have almost nothing in common politically. I don't think that's any different today. Luckily for us, China has never been a hegemonic power in the sense that the Roman Empire was, or the Ottoman Empire was, or the British Empire was, for that matter. They tend to have stayed relatively at home. They've dealt with other Asian powers in the past, obviously Tamerlane and Genghis Khan and people like that. But the Chinese themselves have not been particularly expansionist. The question now, which I want to emphasize and leave you with, is this. China is unique in that it combines Marxist philosophy with its own long and very distinguished and much older history than that of the West. This combination is what I believe is the threat. The Communist Party, as it's been noted earlier by Brian, I believe, is the largest sort of dominant force in the world. It controls more than 1 billion people. They clearly, through technology, want to expand their ability to control us all around the world. So they don't need to physically conquer the West in order to control the West. So that is our great challenge, and that's why the committee's work here is so important, and I'm so honored to be asked to speak to it today. Once you combine Marxism, which has been discredited every time it's been practiced, with capitalism, in other words, you remove the economic component of Marxism and you inject a kind of state-run fascistic capitalism, more along the Mussolini line than the Soviet line, you now have a very potent force. How we are going to deal with that is up to the scientists, the technology people, the intelligence people in this room, military people, the congressmen. That's not for mere writers to say. My only job is to point out to you that this is a very old danger. It's not only present, but it's past and it's future, since the past, the present, and the future are all related. I like to tell audiences that during the whole Russian collusion mess of late memory, Russia, I hope, yeah, well, they won't, they never stop, they never sleep, they never quit, as I like to say on Twitter. What was important about that was the mischaracterization of Russia as an enemy. I would say that Russia is an adversary, and Russia has always been an adversary. Russia, in fact, is the perfect canary in the coal mine. It's half European and it's half Asian. It has never decided what it wants to be. It speaks French when it suits it. It ignores Western culture when it doesn't. The operas of Tchaikovsky, based on Pushkin, are part of the Russian desire to be part of the West, but be different at the same time. And the Russians will always like that. I have a lot of experience with Russia. In fact, 33 years ago, I was in Russia when Chernobyl blew up this last couple of weeks, with the anniversary of it a week or two ago. But the Russians are not enemies. They are adversaries. You have to push them to become an enemy, as the National Socialists of Germany found out. China, on the other hand, is an enemy, and without loading that word and making it too fraught, it is culturally antithetical. It is geographically antithetical. We are conflicting with them in the South China Sea now. But that Silk Road goes all the way to Africa, and we see Chinese economic movement in Africa, South America, and elsewhere. They are a very potent enemy. So Russia's an adversary, China's an enemy. We must act accordingly, and history is our guide to how to combat it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. You take a question?
Yeah, sure.
Michael will take a question or possibly two. Are there any for Michael Walsh? Right over there, please, Tom.
Thanks very much, Mr. Walsh. What do you see from your cultural perspective?
Would you identify yourself, sir?
I'm sorry, Tom McDevitt, Chairman of the Washington Times.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
What do you see as the key vulnerabilities in this global battle, civilization battle with China?
Well, the vulnerabilities is that the West has given up on its own culture. It's become politically incorrect. It is not taught anymore. The influence of the Marxist historians has cut the legs out from underneath our culture, and one of the things I've been doing, and I'll be doing it in a big speech in Los Angeles on Sunday, is to issue a call for cultural restoration in the West. It's ebbed and flowed over the years. Obviously, in the late 5th century, Western culture looked like it was on the ropes when the Visigoths took over Rome. But we always come back because we have this patrimony that, while not as old as China's, is still pretty old. It goes back to the Greeks. It goes back to Homer. In my last book, I said there's more political wisdom to be found in Homer than there is in the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I actually believe that. We can learn from the great works of art and Western civilization how our forebears dealt with existential threats. It's not pretty sometimes, but it's important for us to know that. And until we restore that in the schools and in our culture, we have nothing to defend. The Minuteman there with the rifle knew what he was fighting for, but we don't anymore.
What are the vulnerabilities that you see in China, given their unique?
Microphone.
Yeah, well, the question is, what about the vulnerabilities in China itself? I would say this, that China is not a hegemonic power, and it doesn't really know what to do with it if it is. Now, what we obviously need to do is break the power of the PRC via Huawei, if that's the mechanism they're now using, and protect ourselves against that. I live much of the year in Ireland, and everybody uses Huawei there. And so the Europeans are very much opposed to our designation of Huawei as a threat. But we have to understand the Chinese mentality and the Chinese sensibility. It's very difficult for us to do that, but it requires education and some smarts at the college and postgraduate level.
Thank you very much. Derek?
Derek Harvey from the HIPSI, House Intelligence Committee.
Mm-hmm.
You said that China is not a hegemonic power. Are you saying that they are not intent on becoming a hegemonic power, given that they're building a blue water navy, aircraft carriers, expanding bases worldwide, hypersonic weapons, missile deployment facilities, positioning in Antarctica and other places?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Maybe I wasn't clear. They have not historically been one, but this combination of Marxist thought and China's strong cultural power, intellectual power, may be changing that. They clearly want to provoke confrontations with the United States in Asian waters, as did, as you know, the Japanese during World War II. So whether China will push that into the military sphere so far as to provoke a conflict, I'm not qualified to tell you. But I think, unlike the Japanese, who were expansionist for much of their history once they broke out of the self-imposed isolation, the Chinese have tended not to be. It's a question of the leadership, of course, rather than the people.
We'll take one more. Then we're going to move along.
Salih Hudayar with the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement.
Mm-hmm.
I'd just like to make a comment. I disagree. The fact that you said China historically has never been a hegemonic power. Well, during the Han Dynasty, China was trying to control the Silk Road, so it invaded Central Asia,
yes.
And there was actually a century of back and forth conflict. Then during the Tang Dynasty, they did the same thing as well. And then post 1949, with the rise of communist China, the communist forces, they invaded East Turkestan, they invaded Tibet, and took over what was formerly the Manchu Qing Dynasty. So, and then now you see them rising, trying to expand their political, economic, and military influence across, not just Central Asia and East Asia, but across the world in general. So,
well, they certainly did defend the Silk Road, that's for sure. But I meant it in the sense of, perhaps this is my Western bias, in the sense of Western empires that go out and look to conquer lands very far away. China's always defended its own borders in the way the Soviet Union tried to do with the Warsaw Pact, for example, push the West as far back as it can. But so far, historically, I don't believe China's ever had global conquest in mind. If that's what they have in mind for us now, then lock up your refrigerator and wear a lead suit, because here comes 5G. Thank you very much.